Hi, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the webinar sessions organized by the British Council Indonesia. Let me greet audience, people from different parts of the countries in the region. If you're from Korea, annyeonghaseyo. If you're from Thailand, sawadee krap. And if you're from Indonesia, selamat pagi. And for the rest of you, good morning. My name is Willy Renandia, and I'm privileged to be assisting the British Council Indonesia in putting together a series of webinars under the broad theme of English language teaching today, opportunities and challenges. The purpose of this series of webinar is to engage you, the audience, in a dialogue, in a conversation about trends, about recent trends, that are happening in our field, and with the hope that you will be able to work with us to reflect on these trends, and also, if possible, try to see how these trends can be translated in the language classroom. As I mentioned early on, there's going to be a 4 webinar series. The first one is today, and the title is Strategies for Teaching Multimodal Literacy. And the 2 speakers today are Victor Lim and Lindsay Herron. Victor Lim is from Singapore, and Lindsay Herron is from the US, but currently she is working in Gwangju, Korea. The following week, on the same Saturday, we'll be having the second session in the webinar series. And the topic is also equally interesting and exciting. It's on how we can help students improve on their English language proficiency using extensive reading and listening. And the speakers will be Professor Rod Waring and myself. The following week, also on the 3rd Saturday of March, we'll have another exciting session. It's on task and project-based learning. And the speakers are Professor Rod Ellis from Curtin University, and a colleague of mine from Universitas Negeri Malang, Indonesia, Francisca Yvonne, and they'll be telling you everything that you ever want to know about task-based and project-based learning. And the very last, the 4th webinar will be happening on the 26th of March. The topic will be on writing, and the 2 speakers will be focusing on how we can help our students develop their writing skills. And the speakers, both are well-known second language writing speakers. The first one is Ken Highland from the UK, and the second one is IC Lee from the Chinese University of Hong Kong. Ladies and gentlemen, before we begin, we'd like to remind you of some of the housekeeping matters. First off, please be reminded that the session today is recorded and live streamed as well. Another thing that I'd like to remind you is that, during the Q&A session, we would like to invite you to write your questions in the Q&A box, not on the chat section, but on the Q&A box or the chat section of the YouTube streaming application. At the end of the session, we'd like to invite you to provide feedback so that we can, do a better job next time. And right after the feedback, you'll be able to download your e-certificate. Ladies and gentlemen, it's now my great pleasure to invite my colleague from the British Council of Jakarta, Mr. Colm Downs, Director of English Education and Society, British Council, Indonesia, Jakarta. Colm?
Thank you very much, Pat Willie, and good morning, everybody. As Willie said, my name's Colm. I'm in Jakarta, and I'm delighted to be with you all here this morning. I'm the Director for English Education and Society for the British Council in Indonesia. I'm not going to spend very much time this morning. I just really wanted to say that we are delighted to have Professor Willie Renandia as the host for this special webinar series in March. And we're very we're honored to have Professor Willie, but we're also honored to have 8 fantastic speakers from across East Asia and around the world who'll be sharing their expertise with you in these 4 sessions. We're very passionate at the British Council about professional development opportunities for teachers. And one of the good things about this current situation, if you like, is that we've got much better at being able to bring these, invite speakers to share their expertise online for free for everybody, so that more people can get access to their experience, their knowledge, their resources, their recommendations to help you improve your teaching practice with your students, whether you're a teacher in a university or in a school, primary school or secondary school. I'm sure you'll learn something today and in the other sessions that is going to be useful for you in helping you develop as a teacher, and that will help your students as well. So that's really all I wanted to say this morning. I really appreciate you coming and tuning in, giving up a little bit of your Saturday. I'm sure it will be worth it. So thank you very much. Enjoy this series and follow our social media accounts on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter if you want to know more about our activities and resources. So thank you very much, and I'll hand back to Professor Willie Renandia. Over to you, Willie.
Thank you, Colm. Ladies and gentlemen, we are about ready to begin, and the first speaker is going to be Professor Victor Lim, a colleague of mine, currently teaching in my university, Nanyang Technological University, at the School of Education, locally known as the National Institute of Education. Victor is very, very passionate about multimodal literacy. He teaches a number of courses related to multimodal literacy, and he has also done a number of big research projects on multimodal literacy. He published a very, very exciting book last year, and the title is Designing Learning and Embodied Teaching Perspectives from Multimodality, published by Routledge last year. And he is currently working on another book project. It's going to be called Designing Learning for Multimodal Literacy teaching, viewing, and representing. Victor is going to be sharing with you everything that you ever want to know, almost everything that you ever want to know about multimodal literacy for teaching purposes as well as for research purposes. Ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome Professor Victor Lim.
Thank you very much, Professor Willie, for the very kind introduction. Let me begin by sharing my screen. Good morning, everybody. May I check that you're able to see the screen well?
Yes.
Yes, thank you very much. I would like to thank the British Council for the kind invitation for me to present my work at this session. And I would like to thank you especially for taking time off on a Saturday morning to join us. So I would like to encourage you to make this session yours. I would share for about 30 minutes some of the key ideas with regard to multimodal literacy learning. I will talk about the what, why, and how of multimodal literacy learning. And I want to encourage you to put in your questions in the chat function, in the Q&A function, so that we are able to address some of the queries that you may have at the end of it all. So I'm very excited to be able to share with you an area of work that I've been doing for the last few years, and I believe that is of value for the education system and for us to think about what literacy education means in today's age. So let me start with the fundamentals. What is multimodal literacy? I mean, this is a term that has emerged very recently in the educational context when we talk about literacy learning. And some people might wonder, what is this term idea about? Well, multimodality highlights that people draws on distinctly different sets of resources for meaning making. So thinking about how when we teach in the classroom, we are not just using words, but the gestures that we use, the gaze that we use to engage the students, the positioning and movement of the teacher in the classroom also create meaning. So I want to extend this to think about learning and to think about how the kind of resources that our students engage with in their classroom has moved from just words on a page to include also images, animations in the resources that they learn in a particular subject. Now, the idea of multiliteracies was first introduced to the world in 1996 in a manifesto by the New London Group. So some of you may be very familiar with the idea of multiliteracies, and multiliteracies has challenged us to think about what it means to be literate in today's digital age. So thinking about the kind of life world that our young people engage in out of school, the kind of communication they have on social media with one another, which again moves beyond just using language, words to create meaning, but using images, animations, and music as well. So the New London Group, this is the original group that introduced the idea to the world, explained that they added two multis to literacies. The first is in recognition to the enormous and significant differences in context and patterns of communication. So thinking about this was at the cusp of the 21st century. And during that period of time, there was a lot of interest in the idea of globalization, how the world has become smaller, how it is now a global village. And therefore, in the classroom, you will have students from diverse backgrounds bringing with them different experiences. So that is one aspect of multiliteracies. And the second aspect of multiliteracies is the multimodality, recognizing that there's a variability of meaning making in different cultural, social, or domain-specific contexts nowadays with digital technology enabling new ways of meaning making. And that is what we see as multimodal literacy, the multimodality aspect. Carrie Jewick, in her work, reflected on the multimodal turn in education and thinking about how the idea of expanding literacy education beyond just language learning has been reflected in many education systems and the literacy curriculum of many systems. In Australia, Finland, Singapore, US, UK, just to name a few, have broadened their literacy curriculum to include multimodality as part of the outcomes that they want to develop in their students. So essentially, it is a fundamental recognition that there are many ways in which meanings can be made, and therefore there's a need for us to build up the semiotic resources of students who are recognized as agentive meaning makers across contexts as part of the literacy curriculum requirement. Now, make no mistake, language is still important, and language is still the fundamental way in which we communicate. But one of the key understanding of multimodal literacy is that language is not the only way, and there are other ways in which we make meaning, and therefore we need to build up that semiotic resource of students. The term multimodal literacy was proposed by Carrie Dewey and Günther Kress in their work, in their book, Multimodal Literacy, to represent the understanding and competency across semiotic modes. They argue, of course, that information and knowledge are constructed in multimodal texts and discourses, which require a multimodal literacy to fully assess their meanings. And more importantly, is to think about how the shifts in meaning representation change the meaning made. What do I mean by that? So if you think about the textbook of the past, where knowledge is represented mostly with words, right? So if you think about a science textbook, in the past, it used to be densely packed with words. Now, if you look at the textbooks that our young people have today, they are filled with images, they are filled with graphs, they are filled with diagrams. So knowledge is represented not just in words, but also with other semiotic resources. So how does this change the way in which knowledge and understanding is communicated and learned in the particular subject? So multimodal literacy, in a sense, we define that as the knowledge and skills for students and teachers as they engage in the critical viewing of the kind of multimodal text around them, as well as the creative representing with multimodal text. We know that with digital technology, it's very easy for a student to create videos as a way to express their learning, to create websites, collages, posters, as a way to express the kind of learning that they have, the kind of meanings they want to make. So multimodal literacy involves the knowledge and skills in that meaning-making process. It involves that semiotic awareness that Taundro talked about, as well as the ability to orchestrate across different ways of meaning-making, different modes of meaning-making. So in a sense, I hope I have given you a basic understanding of what multimodal literacy is and how that involves an expansion, a broadening of what we typically think of literacy beyond language learning. So the question you may ask is, isn't this intuitive? Why is there a need for us to teach multimodal literacy? Why is there for us a need for us to expand the curriculum to include multimodal meaning making? Well, one of the reasons is that recognition that a popular idea in education, when we talk about young people today, or the millennials that we have, is the notion of the digital natives. So this is a notion that was coined by Mark Prensky. It refers to millennial learners who have grown up with a host of relatively new technologies. So we look at our children, we look at the young people in our classroom, they are very savvy with the use of computer, cell phones, video games as part of their life world. So we know that these digital natives connect with friends and family through social networking, text messaging, and other technologically mediated approach. And this particular notion has influenced many policies and practices in the way we engage with these young people. However, we also recognize more recently that the idea of the digital native can be contested. In fact, some have seen that as a myth, really. We recognize that digital natives have grown up using technologies, but they may not be necessarily adept in digital skills, such as producing and interpreting visual communication. In fact, we also recognize that even though they may grow up with digital technologies and use digital technology as part of their out-of-school meaning-making activities, they may not necessarily be adept in using the same skills for learning as well. And this is because digital natives neither possess equal digital literacies, and they are not a homogeneous group, so they're not quite the same. This is because they have differential access, they have different opportunities based on the kind of backgrounds that they have, the socioeconomic status, the kind of access to devices, the kind of guidance and family support that we have. So it's not taken for granted that young people can use technology well, that young people are able to make meaning well with digital technology. Now, we heard of the digital divide, and many of you are familiar with the idea of the digital divide, especially in big countries like Indonesia, where access to computers can be an issue, can be a barrier to the kind of learning experiences we want to design for the students. But it's also interesting to note that beyond access to infrastructure, another concern with regard to the digital divide is the idea of the kind of digital literacies needed to harness and make the most of the kind of technology that's available to our students. In fact, Andre's literature talks about how about 17% of 15-year-olds who may grow up with the computers may not possess the kind of digital skills to navigate the digital environment, right? And thus the new digital divide, or the second digital divide, is more than just about access to hardware and infrastructure, but it's really about the knowledge and skills to navigate the digital environment. In a work that is done by Maria Grazia-Sindoni, they look at the idea of digital literacy and they try to unpack it according to a few dimensions. So what we may be familiar with is the idea of digital technology, being able to use tools well. But beyond that, there are other dimensions that she highlighted as well. So for instance, multimodal orchestration, how we are able to use various semiotic resources well to make meaning. And this is what we call multimodal literacy here. And there are other aspects such as intercultural communications and transversal skills. So things like critical thinking, soft skills in terms of resilience, that is part of the dimensions of digital literacies. But we want to focus on multimodal orchestration when we talk about multimodal literacy. So in a nutshell, we recognize that the changing nature of the communication landscape, we recognize the new technologies that we have around us is making that need for us to broaden our definition of literacy. And as Günter Kress pointed out, that literacy in the new media age, in today's age, will involve human cognitive, affective, cultural, and bodily engagement with the world and on the forms and shapes of knowledge. So therefore, there's a shift away from alphabetic literacy, making meaning with just language, to explore the kind of new forms of literacies needed in today's world. As a result, recognizing the different type of learners that we have in our classroom, the different readiness for them to make meaning with multimodal resources, the different kind of background and guidance and support they have from home, we need them to think about what the school can offer to them to help them be literate and ready to engage with the communicative demands of today's landscape as well as tomorrow's workplace. So in this light, the literacy curriculum, I argue, cannot remain a solely language-focused curriculum, because to be considered literate in this day and age is to be able to effectively communicate multimodally. And this recognition demands an evolution of our literacy curriculum beyond just the reading, beyond just the teaching and learning of reading in print, to thinking about reading both in print as well as on screen, because so much of our knowledge is mediated by the screen interface. From that of reading of books to that of reading of books and viewing multimodal text critically, from that of even writing to writing and typing, and from speaking to speaking and representing creatively. I mean, if you think about the presentation that I'm making to you right now, I'm speaking, but at the same time, I'm using my slides to represent the ideas to you. So I think this is the big question that we want to address after we have understood the what of multimodal literacy, and also reflected on some of the reasons why we want to teach multimodal literacy to our students. Why is there a need for us to broaden language learning in literacy? So what are some ideas, what are some thinking that we can apply when we teach multimodal literacy? Now here I draw from several research projects that I have been involved in the last few years. I have a research project in Singapore looking at how we can integrate the teaching of multimodal literacies into the language curriculum. And we have several other research projects where we explore the kind of learning and literacy demonstrated by students as they play video games, as they engage in educational apps, as they make meaning with their friends in their own life work. So based on that, I want to just summarize some big ideas on what we can start thinking about when we want to teach multimodal literacy. So what are these? I'm going to talk very quickly about four big ideas. The first is to think about designing learning processes, the kind of pedagogical processes that you have in a classroom to help students develop multimodal literacy. The second is about how we can introduce a meta language to help both the teachers and students to think and talk about multimodal meaning making. The third is to explore how we can intentionally design opportunities for students to create multimodal artifacts so that they're able then to express their ideas, their experiences, not just with words alone, but other ways of meaning making. And finally, I'm going to conclude with a reflection on how we can value students' life world literacies in our school. So very quickly, the first is what are the learning processes we can think about when we want to design for multimodal literacy in the classroom? Well, the idea of the learning processes is very much based on the work of Bill Cope and Mary Calantis when they talk about the kind of processes that we want to have in a multi-literacy classroom. So here in this particular framework, we describe how a multimodal literacy classroom can be designed where you have processes to allow students to encounter text, explore text, express the text, and evaluate the text. Now, what do I mean? The first learning process is encountering. This relates to giving students the opportunity. Oh, sorry. Let me start maybe by the bottom green at the bottom green area, where we start with exploring. One of the first processes that you can do is exploring, where we allow students the opportunity to think about the kind of text that they have in the classroom, right? To bring in live text from their world and think about how they can use this text to learn the kind of multimodal meaning making processes. So getting them to notice the way the meanings are made in the text. So for instance, you can get them to bring in posters that they see around them and bring and talk about how this particular poster engage them or doesn't engage them, and think about how what are the strategies that are used in this poster to get the students to be persuaded on buying the product or the services with that. So that's in relation to getting them to make the connection between what they're learning in the classroom with what they're experiencing out of the school. And then we talk about having that resources, the meta language, to get them to then describe the meanings that are made in the posters. So thinking about how they can analyze the choices in the poster and recognize the perspectives that are offered to influence the way that they think. So relating that to evaluating, and that is part of asking students questions about the kind of text that they experience. And the next process is in relation to expressing, where we get students to then have the opportunity to apply what they have learned through making of artifacts themselves. So if you take a step back, if you think about the learning processes in a multimodal literacy classroom, they should allow students to have opportunity to both explore their texts, even as they encounter them, as well as to give them the opportunity to evaluate the meanings that are made and to express these meanings multimodally. So that is the idea of thinking about learning processes for multimodal literacy. The second is to introduce a meta language for students to think and talk about multimodality. Now, a meta language for learning is important because if you think about the teaching of language, you teach students also grammatical categories. You teach them to identify what's the difference between a noun and a verb. You teach them to identify certain grammatical rules, such as subject-verb agreement. Similarly, when we introduce different ways of meaning making beyond language, we want to also offer students a pedagogic meta-language so that they can start by identifying the different forms of meanings as well as the functions in which they serve. So we have illustrated this in one of the articles that I work with Bill and Mary, and if you're interested, you can find out a little bit more about that. But very quickly, I'm just going to give you a sense of what it looked like. This is important, especially given the diversity and differences in social backgrounds of students. A common pedagogic meta-language as a resource for the description and discussion of multimodal meaning can help to increase the students' semiotic awareness, help them to be a bit more sensitive to the ways that meanings are made. And of course, the idea of having a meta-language for multimodal meaning making is not new. I mean, it has been widely advocated by several scholars. Ultimately, is to give students a way to be able to describe and discuss the meanings that are made. Right? They need a kind of meta-language to talk about language, images, sounds. And this kind of meta-language can give students and teachers a means of comparing text and determining what semiotic choices were made in relation to the particular meanings, and also thinking about the kind of effects of choices that have been made. In a project that was done by Mary McCann-Horowitz and colleagues in Australia schools, where they introduced a set of meta-language guided by appraisal theory and systemic functional linguistics to primary school students, they noted that the meta-language can help the students to structure their noticing, offering them a fresh view of choices that may have been taken for granted in didactic reading. So the meta-language was used as a way to guide them to notice various choices that have been made in the text. And it was also turning up in their writing and talking and reshaping the way they have been thinking about images and how these images contribute to higher order of meanings in multimodal text. So what is this meta-language that we talk about? Well, within the field of academic scholarship, there's a number of meta-languages that have been developed to help students understand and make sense of multimodal meaning making. This is the work that I have done with Bill and Mary with regards to understanding the forms and functions of meaning in the classroom. So this is based, of course, on their work on multimodal grammar, and we try to pedagogize it to think about how the changes, the transposition from speech, sound, body, object, space, image, and written text can be explored. So thinking about how a word like love can be expressed. Well, the word love that is expressed in speech is expressed in writing, so that is clear. But how is love expressed as an image? Can love be expressed through space? Can the idea of love be expressed through an object? And what about a body? And how does the sound of love, how does sound communicate the meaning of love? So thinking about how specific meanings can be expressed in different ways, multimodally, and at the same time thinking about how certain modes are better at expressing certain ideas than others. So for instance, an image may be better at expressing the idea of love than space. So thinking about what you can do and what you cannot do with certain different modes. So introducing the idea of different modes in the classroom, and also thinking about the kind of functions that meaning serve. So when they encounter a particular text, and I mentioned just now, a poster, they can consider the reference of what the poster is about, the message is about. They can consider the aspect of the agency, who is doing this, right? They can consider the aspect of the structure. How does the poster work together? The composition, the layout, the placement of the poster work together coherently, cohesively to make meaning. They can consider the aspect of context in relation to when and where this is connected, where this poster is situated in, the kind of cultural background that is placed in. And they can consider the aspect of interest as well, the why. What is this poster for? So what we try to do is to think about the functions of meaning and how they can unpack in very simple ways to help students reflect on the kind of text that they encounter. And this will help them in the interpretation, in the exploration that they make with the specific text. So this is the kind of meta language that we want to bring into the classroom as a way to guide students in thinking and talking about multimodal meaning making. So ultimately, there are different types of pedagogic meta language specific for various types of text. Ultimately, a meta language will introduce the integral features of the text. So for instance, if you have a meta language for films, what are some of the features of a particular film? Let's say we talk about a documentary. What are some of these integral features that are there? What are some of the ways that ideas are expressed? How does the film, the documentary, seeks to persuade you? What are the ways of interaction that it has with the audience? How does it shape you into thinking about certain ideas, and also exploring how the acting, the music, the editing, the different modes in the film work together in an interplay to create specific meanings. So that is what we want to do with the pedagogic meta language, essentially giving students a way to think and talk about multimodal text. And over the last few years, I've been doing a lot of work in terms of trying to describe a set of meta language for different types of text that we have, that we can bring to the classroom. And these are ways in which we can begin to help students reflect on the nature of this text and to describe the meanings that are made across a range of multimodal texts. What are the other strategies that we can have in the classroom besides being mindful of the learning processes that we design, besides introducing a meta language as a resource for students to think and talk about multimodal meaning making? Well, another thing that we realized from our project is that we want to encourage students and teachers. We want to encourage teachers in particular to create opportunities for students to make meaning multimodally, to create opportunities for students digital multimodal composing. This is because we recognize that students learn through meaning making. And in designing students' learning experiences, the kind of opportunities can help students then to be more aware of the use of different modes to create meaning, and to think about how these modes can be used to reflect their identities as well as the ideas that they have. One of the things that we noted in our project, this was a paper that we published, was that in the Singapore classroom at this point in time, there was limited opportunities for students multimodal composing, and partly due to the assessment, of course, where it's still very much language-based. And that was something that we reflected back to the ministry, and that's something that we want to encourage the teachers in Singapore to think about as well. And I believe that this will be relevant to different parts of the world as we want to encourage a deeper learning of multimodal literacy. How can we create opportunities for students multimodal composing in the classroom? Now, you may think that this sounds like very big ideas and that it sounds very abstract. How do I actually do it in the kind of primary, secondary school classroom that I am teaching? Now, I want to share with you what I did with my students in the pre-service teaching course that I have at the National Institute of Education. So it's a class with teachers that will soon graduate to become primary school teachers in the classroom. So I thought about how I can create opportunities for them to engage in multimodal composing and to inspire them to use such approaches as well when they become primary school teachers in the classroom. So these were some of the things that I did. This is part of the learning that I have with students on the Edmodo platform, a learning platform. And I designed a number of activities for them to participate during the synchronous online learning session. And this is an example of the last activity. So you can see the date, it was fairly recent. It was only in September 2021. And what I wanted to do was for the students to use storyboard deck as a way to create a comic strip. Now, this was a lesson on transmedia, thinking about how certain medias are now translated and expressed across different types of fonts. So if you think about the familiar story of the ugly duckling, right? It's a fairy tale, but it can also be expressed in a film or in a game app. So that is the entire transmedia enterprise. And I wanted them at the end of the lesson to have the opportunity to create their own transmedia as well. In this case, I wanted them to create a comic strip based on a familiar story that they know of. right? So they use storyboard that to do that. And this was some examples, right? So this is an example by one student using the storyboard that to create a comic strip and making a very interesting turn on the very familiar story of the Three Little Pigs, right? So here, rather than positioning the wolf as someone that wants to attack the pig, he actually positions the wolf as having a relationship, likely to be a spousal relationship with the pig, right? So and the reason why he wanted to blow the house down was because he was sick, right? So he wanted to have some flu medication, and the student used this opportunity as a way to reflect about how we express love differently. And this is another example. Many of you will know the story of the ugly duckling, and here, interestingly, rather than the duckling seeing herself aspiring to become a swan, this was actually a swan that was looking at herself in the mirror and seeing herself as an ugly duckling instead. So again, it was a twist to the story because in this regard, it was a story about having a positive self-image for yourself, right? So again, using the genre of a transmedia, using comic strip, students are able to express their ideas, their creativity, as well as also a certain level of semiotic awareness based on what we have introduced to them in the earlier part of the lesson as well. This is another example where students were given the opportunity to think about the relationship between words and images. So essentially, I gave them a series of images that they can look at. And when they look at the image, they had to jot down a particular word that comes to mind. When they look at the image, they have to think about the photo, describe the emotions they experience, think about a sound or melody that accompany the visual, and then to write a story to that the image evoked for them on Padlet, right? So it was an exercise that we did in class, and ultimately, students were to respond to the image and create the story. And this is the kind of stories that the students produce. Very short stories of just a few sentences, very much inspired by the image. And through a simple activity like this, you can get the students to then again be sensitive to how meanings are made in the image and think about how they can create a story using words that complement what is represented in the image. So thinking about the interplay of meanings between words and images. So again, not a very difficult task for the students to do in your class. And of course, the challenge is how can we design for it meaningfully and provide students with the resources through a meta language to guide them in this. And this is my last example. This was one of the earlier lessons that I did with the students in the same class. And here was getting this happens after I have taught them a series of lessons on recognizing how gestures, facial expressions, positioning can make meaning. So thinking about how the semiotic resources in images can make specific types of meanings. And what I wanted to do was to relate that to their identity as a future teacher, right? So in this particular checkout activity, we wanted them to think about how they can create a comic character using this free software, Gramagear, all right? And to design a comic character to represent themselves as an English teacher, right? So they have to then make certain choices in the creation of their comic character and to think about how these choices reflect their identity as a teacher. Then after that, of course, they have to explain it in some words to help us understand the reasons for their choices. And this is what I have from the students creating a bean and thinking about how the choices that has been made reflects the identity that the student had, right? And even the choices of color can be meaningful as well. And this is another representation from a student, okay? And again, what I wanted to show you through these practices is that it is not difficult for you to incorporate multimodal literacy into the classroom. These are very simple strategies that can be done, and this can be used almost at different levels of teaching that you are at. Finally, I just want to conclude with the last consideration with regard to the teaching of multimodal literacy. And that is in relation to thinking about how we can, as an education system, schools, teachers, as well as the Ministry of Education, have a greater value of the students' life work and the kind of literacies that they demonstrate in their life work. Well, the life work relates to the kind of experiences that the students have outside the classroom, and a lot of learning takes place as well through immersion, through the kind of experiences that they have. So for instance, the kind of activities that engage in gameplay with one another, the kind of communication that they have as they engage in social media exchanges, and what are some of this learning that we wanted to understand. What are some of the learnings that were demonstrated by the students through this? So in one of the projects that we did was we analyzed YouTube video productions made by children. And then as we look at the video production, we identify aspects of creativity, critical thinking, and semiotic awareness that the students demonstrated. And many a times in a lot of education systems, these are aspects in which is highly valued. In Singapore, we call that as 21st century competencies. Other systems may call it as new literacies. But we do want to encourage our students to become more creative, to demonstrate critical thinking. So the challenge is, how can these video productions on YouTube made by children offer opportunities for this sort of learning? We also analyzed the video gameplay of youth and identified their demonstration, again, of critical thinking, but also empathy and multimodal literacy in their digital play. And I think with the kind of work that we did, I think the question we had for teachers and schools was, how can we then value and recognize this kind of literacies that students demonstrate in their life work, and how can we bring that into the classroom? Because we do want to recognize learning, and one of the key understanding in multimodal literacy is when we recognize students' design work as learning, it can allow students to meet it can allow teachers to meet the students where they are by first understanding how they have been using their available resources to make meaning aptly, what they know about video production, what they know about social media communication, and then subsequently making available to them the resources which society has privileged in specific knowledge domains. So for instance, the resources that society has privileged could be language. So how can we then provide them with the linguistic resources so that they're able then to augment and transform the kind of text that they are already making out there? And finally, I think one aspect that we reflected on through our projects was the need for assessment changes. And that can take place, of course, at a system level. So I'm speaking to policymakers here in the audience, school leaders here in the audience, but that can also take place in the classroom. So I'm speaking to teachers in the classroom. So changes in assessment as a signal of what is deemed as socially valued knowledge needs to be made in tandem so that we can influence deep changes in the kind of pedagogical practices we have in the classroom. So as a teacher in the classroom, what kind of assessment do you have for your students? Do you just have assessment that is only pen and paper in nature? Or do you encourage students to explore different ways of making meaning? So for instance, you include e-portfolio, you include collages, you include video productions, comic strips as a way for them to learn and to express their learning. So these are some of the strategies that I have highlighted based on the work that I have done, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts and feedback on them. Thank you very much.
Clap, clap. Thank you very much, Victor. Very exciting and very insightful presentation on multimodal literacy. Can I just ask one small question before we move on to the next speaker? I think Lindsay is so excited and anxious to start as well. Yeah, Victor, what are some of the challenges of teaching multimodal literacy in the school context? Because teachers usually, in many parts of the world, they don't have access to digital materials, and the kind of materials that they use is likely to be, text, maybe with some, fixed images, but the full range of resources that you mentioned may not be available for both the teachers and also the students. Is there anything that you could, advise for those people?
Thank you, Dr. Billy. I think that is a very important question, especially in reflection to the very diverse group of participants that we have today. I would like to make it very clear that when we talk about multimodal text, they need not be digital in nature. Of course, with digital technology, it allows new ways of meaning making, right? Which is exciting, which is great. But we are talking about also posters that are print in nature, but consist of images. But we know that color and layout can be meaningful as well. So recognizing that multimodal text need not be digital in nature, and they can have access to the kind of print live text that the students have available in the live world. So looking around them, what kind of text do they use to communicate and bring this text into the classroom? I would say that the main challenge really is having that shared language for students and teachers to talk about meaning making. And that is why the work on the meta language is useful, because it gives both teachers and students a sensitivity to how, say, meanings are made in images and a shared vocabulary so that they can talk about how the meanings are made in the specific image that they're looking at.
Yes. Another follow-up question, this came from the one of the members of the audience, is whether and to what extent we need to go full-fledged, so to speak, when we consider multimodal literacy for older students or for older people like you and me. Many of the teachers here are older people. They have had a lot of experience doing the sort of the monomodal, if you like, literacy. For some of them, some of the things to do with multimodal literacy, like adding images, can come, intuitively or quite naturally. So to what extent do we need to relearn or unlearn some of the older literacies that we have acquired over the years?
Thanks. I think that's also a very important question to consider. The idea really is to build on what we have already know, what we already learned. So building on our existing resources. Now, for older learners or for adults, how can multimodal literacy be relevant? I think the main thrust really is to recognize that there can be ideologies, there can be values, there can be messages that are communicated, not just with language, but through multimodal text as well. So again, if you think about news, I know in the last administration in the US, there's a lot of interest in fake news, right? But fake news continue to be very important as a concern today, right? And these fake news are not presented just with words. They are presented through images, and they seek to elicit an emotional engagement with you rather than cognitive engagement. So they seek to persuade you with emotions, with videos, with photographs, to get you to think about it in a specific ways. And therefore, if you think about that critical viewing of the kind of text around us, I think multimodal literacy will help us to be a bit more discerning as adults, and to recognize perspectives and to question and interrogate the kind of text we experience.
Yes, agree. It's important to be discerning. It's important to be critical. It's a very important point that I will get back to you a bit later after Lindsay's presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, please give another round of applause for Professor Victor Lim from National Institute of Education, Nanyang Technological University. Ladies and gentlemen, let me now pass on the screen to my co-moderator today, Ming Sawasdipon. Locally in Thailand, people will call her Ajan. Ajan means teacher, yeah? Ajan Ming Sawasdipon. Yes. Ajan Ming, please go ahead.
So, Sawadee, and good morning to everyone from Thailand. My name is Ming Sawatdipon. I used to be a part-time lecturer at Chulalongkorn University for English foundational courses, but right now I'm a full-time PhD student from the English as an International Language program, also at Chulalongkorn University. It's a pleasure and it's an honor for me to be here with you all today. So let me introduce you to the second guest speaker for today's session. So we have Professor Lindsay Herron. Professor Lindsay Herron has been a visiting professor at Gwangju National University of Education in Korea since 2008. Currently a doctoral candidate in literacy, culture, and language education, LCLE, at Indiana University. She also has a master's in LCLE, another master's in cinema studies, bachelor's degrees in English literature and psychology, a postgraduate certificate in learning sciences, media, and technology, a CELTA, and a CELTA YL extension. Her current research focuses on the multimodal interactions and critical cosmopolitan literacies of language learners participating in an online cross-cultural exchange. So for today's presentation, her presentation will be on making learning meaningful and memorable through multimodal projects. So ladies and gentlemen, please join me, perhaps internally, in welcoming Professor Lindsay. Professor Lindsay, please.
Thank you so much for that warm introduction. I'm really excited to be here today, presenting about one of my favorite topics. And I'm especially excited to be following such an interesting introduction to teaching multimodal literacy. In fact, some of the things I'll be talking about today were already covered, but I think it's useful to hear it again in a different way, from a different perspective, for a slightly different purpose. I've also been kind of following the Q&A and the discussion in the chat, so I'm really excited to be participating this way with all of you. So today, I'm going to talk about making learning meaningful and memorable through multimodal projects. If you had questions about Professor Lim's presentation earlier, how to use it in the classroom, this is another way you can do it. So today, we're going to briefly talk about why, when, how, and what of multimodal projects. But first, just to be clear, let's make sure we're all on the same page. What is a multimodal project? Now, this was covered very well by Professor Lim, but just to make sure, modes are your communicative or semiotic resources. Now, you use these all the time in everyday life. Don't be scared by the idea because you're surrounded by modes. You're using modes all the time. It's not just written text in your life, but when you go in the world, you're communicating with your gestures, with your facial expressions, with your body language, with your distance from people, the colors we see, the proximity of things, image, sign, movement, size, sound, volume, intonation, melody, everything that we use to interpret the world, that's probably a mode. But importantly, you need to realize, and you know this, meaning depends on context. So for example, in everyday life, if somebody is walking really close to you, how you understand that depends on the modes, right? It depends on the gestures the person is making, the person's facial expressions, their body language, their proximity, your culture. Is it normal to be standing that close to someone? The movement, are they walking faster? Are they much bigger than you? The way you understand it depends on the context. Is it a totally open space with this person that you don't know who is much bigger than you, walking very fast behind you? You would interpret it differently than if there were a small child that you know who's smiling and laughing. It's a totally different situation, right? But you're interpreting the modes depending on the context. But then when we move to the digital world, it offers all kinds of new opportunities for creating and understanding meaning, including like the font you choose, the interactivity, what you're clicking on, the movement, the motion, the color, the language you're using, cultural references, music, emphasis, special effects, all of that makes meaning. And part of it is also understanding how the other person, that your audience, how they understand what you're trying to communicate. So you have to not only understand your own way of making meaning, but the ways your audience will understand meaning. And that's a very high level 21st century skill, right? Communicating across difference. And remember too, that you're creating meaning in a situated way with the audience in mind, so that you can make good choices to communicate what you have in your head. So why use multimodal projects? Now, if you're here today, you probably have an interest in multimodal projects, but what I'm going to tell you is exactly how you can convince stakeholders like principals or parents, people who think you should be just teaching the language, don't do projects, don't do pictures. This is what you can tell them to justify and support your use of multimodal projects. So first, projects give a realistic context for purposeful language use. You're not just memorizing the language, you're not just memorizing and reciting English, but you're using English for a realistic purpose, like a self-introduction, an advertisement, a recommendation, a wanted poster, infographics or informational pamphlets, explainer videos, class magazines, and more. Projects are really very flexible. Pretty much think about your target language that you're teaching, that you want students to practice, and then what do they use it for in real life? That's your project right there. Also, projects can help students do with understanding. If we look at cognitive science, doing with understanding is how learning happens. That's how learning works. So in order to do that, you need first a clear need or purpose for the learning, for the knowledge. In this case, your purpose is self-expression in context for an audience. And that helps students integrate the target language into their mental model of English and helps them make sense of what they're learning. This is how learning happens exactly. It also supports embodied cognition. Now, there's a lot of research that says the richer the perceptual experience, the better the student learning. In this case, the perceptual experience is, of course, the images, the videos, the interaction, all of that, which helps students consolidate their mental model of English. It also supports experimentation and exploration, the idea of bricolage and understanding in a deeply personal way, because you're expressing yourself and playing around with different combinations of modes in order to get the meaning from your head into your audience's head. And using different modes really does open up possibilities for stories that could not be told through print alone. So it supports self-expression. Now, you know also the 3 keys to motivation, right? Autonomy, purpose, and mastery, if we take that perspective. Well, projects support all of those because students have lots of autonomy in that they can make different choices. They have purpose in sharing their projects with an authentic audience. They're not just creating it for the teacher or for pedagogical purposes. They're creating it to share it and to communicate. And then they can demonstrate mastery in different ways. And the process of project creation can support that mastery as students revise their projects, review what they're kind of shaky on, and then improve the projects not only for their own self-edification, but also for their audience, so they can put their best foot forward. And of course, one of the important things that Professor Lim touched on, multiple literacies. Projects, multimodal projects, especially digital multimodal projects, support new literacy studies idea of multiliteracies. This is what was introduced as from the New London group, the idea that design is situated. We are both inheritors of the patterns and conventions and also active designers of meaning. New literacy studies and multiliteracies value the whole spectrum of communicative practices, including the skills involved in using them together and relating them to each other. It values our entire repertoire of semiotic resources and redefines what counts as knowledge. So it's a redistribution of semiotic power. Maybe you have a student who is not good at English reading or English writing, but they are really good at the visual design elements. So they can use those visual elements to support their language use. And that really does give them a lot of power and is more similar to what happens in the real world because we communicate with so many different modes. This helps make our students 21st century communicators as they creatively communicate across difference. Multimodal projects also supports HOTS. You know HOTS, right? Higher order thinking skills. You're probably familiar with Bloom's taxonomy, but let's take a second to think about Bloom's revised taxonomy. These are the higher order thinking skills, right? Analyze, evaluate, and create. All three of those are definitely supported by multimodal projects. So for example, when you're making a multimodal project, especially in this case, a digital multimodal project, you have to examine all of the options. You have to compare and contrast them. What exactly does this picture mean versus this picture? And then you need to critique and judge which one best expresses my meaning, my intention, and suits the feel of my video, the theme of my pamphlet, the color choices I've made. And then you can start to experiment and evaluate and critique the way it looks as you design something totally new that expresses your personal meaning. And then the process of peer feedback also involves these same higher order thinking skills as students evaluate, judge, critique, make suggestions to help the design improve, like maybe adding a stamp or a heart. And this is involved in the language use also, as students analyze and evaluate the language that is being used in the multimodal project and try to make it as correct and nuanced as possible. Now, digital projects in particular are amazing because they let us reconceptualize time and space. It takes learning outside the boundaries of the classroom. So we move beyond this structured environment to the whole universe of ideas and digital projects and digital effects, and also out into our own communities, the students' homes, the students' families. All of this can be involved in projects, especially digital projects. So projects and digital projects allow for asynchronous creation and interaction. When you share them online with your peers or with other people in different countries even, you have asynchronous interaction, not bounded by the classroom. It gives you new opportunities to privilege, value, and incorporate students' home life and their funds of knowledge. It gives them new opportunities for movement and interaction in space. We all know that sitting for long periods is not conducive to good learning. So students are moving and doing in space embodying their learning and creating new assemblages of resources. They have also at their fingers a World Wide Web's worth of resources, perspectives, and ideas. And as they get new audiences for their work, they have to take on new perspectives in order to communicate effectively. So when and how should we use multimodal projects? Well, I've used it throughout the curriculum, basically, for different purposes. You can use projects to introduce new language. And actually what I like to do is not set the target language, but rather let students use the language and have it emerge from what they need or what they use during the project. So students will start to accomplish the task, start to work on their projects, and I will pull out examples of good language use or good structures that we can focus on to make it even better, or that might be useful. I understand one of the later sessions is on task-based learning, and actually this is exactly what Jane Willis describes in her framework for task-based learning. Projects are also really good for practicing specific target language. If you have an idea of what target language students will need to accomplish it, then you can easily focus on that language and students can use it in productive and useful ways. This could be for an individual unit, practicing specific target language, or for a kind of finale project where students can integrate all of the grammar and works you've been studying in class and put it together for the final demonstration of mastery, say. Or it can be completely no specific target language and students just use the English they already know. This is kind of nice too, because then students are motivated to look up the words and the grammar that they need in order to express themselves most effectively. So the process of doing a project, what I really recommend is something that Mark Barnes has called the role process. So students do the project, they get feedback from their peers or from the teacher. That's where the teacher or the peers say, ooh, this part seems a little bit strange. Maybe you could do it this way. Why did you choose this? Have you thought about doing this instead? Then students revise and apply the feedback and maybe get feedback again, revise and apply, get feedback again, revise and apply. And as they revise each time, they're applying what they should have already learned. They're discovering where their weaknesses are. So they revise to improve their weaknesses. And then finally, they're able to demonstrate mastery through their project. Now, I know a lot of you teach far too many students to give feedback on a one-to-one level throughout the revision process. So in that case, definitely focus on the assignment, making sure students know what to do, and the feedback, especially at the end. If you have time to stop in the middle and remind them, oh, this grammar is not quite right, please review it from 2 weeks ago. Or here's a new exercise you can try for that grammar. That's a great way to do it too. Now, tips. I've been doing projects with my students for a very long time now. So this is what I've found to be very helpful, especially considering I routinely teach at least 150 students a semester. So I know the delicate balancing act of having to deal with each student individually. So my first rule for projects is 3 before me. My students use online tools such as Grammarly to get feedback on their writing, and then they get feedback from 2 or 3 peers. And then that's finally, after it's as good as possible, that's when I take a look at it. I really recommend doing peer feedback in groups. Especially Padlet is a really good tool for this. And don't forget to share the final drafts with classmates. And again, if your learning management system is pretty shaky like mine is, Padlet's another great way to do that. I also recommend maybe modeling good feedback. Some of my students, when we first started doing this, they were very confused and they thought good feedback was, hey, I like BTS too, or hey, I also live in Gwangju. That's not feedback. That's a nice comment, but it's not feedback. So we actually went through the process of what is and is not good feedback, how to give good feedback. And I think the process of focusing on choices, on the multimodal choices, is really a good way to focus students' attention on the multimodal elements and thus increase their multimodal literacy. I also, I noticed in the chat, somebody had a question about giving grades for all of these projects. And honestly, I don't like giving grades for projects because students do tend to work very hard on them. If you have that opportunity, you might consider doing descriptive feedback instead of assigning a specific grade. So it's kind of as if you have a rubric, just copy and paste a lot of the feedback you need, because I know it takes a really long time to give feedback to hundreds of students. I do give minus points if students don't revise, or if they don't give feedback to their peers, or if the project is really obviously last second slapdash, very little work invested in it, clearly. But this is where rubrics could help as well. I find rubrics are great for saving grading time. I do make them part of the initial assignment so that students can see what they're working toward. I make it part of peer feedback, where students can actually go through and tick off what is working well and what maybe could use some improvement. And again, it's focusing students on the multimodal elements so that they know how to improve their own and start paying attention to how others can improve, which gives them their own ideas for improving their own work. Don't forget to leave space for your comments, and definitely on your rubric include not just mechanics like grammar and spelling, but also organization, effectiveness, the multimodal elements. Now, another question people frequently ask is, well, how can we do group projects? And I'll be honest, I don't like group projects. I hated them in university. I hated them in high school because there's always one student who does nothing and one student who does everything. I was always the student who did everything. And so I never liked group projects. But there are some very effective ways to do group projects if you want to use those in your class. And that's another good way to kind of limit the amount of feedback you need to do by kind of consolidating your students into groups. So one thing that works really well and is very similar to what happens in real life is each member in the group takes a specific role. I usually don't dictate the roles, but rather let each group list what each student is doing, what each student is responsible for. I've also used self and peer ratings for group participation so that the students rate their own group participation as well as the participation of their peers. My ratings are pretty basic. It's basically, came to group meetings, supported and encouraged your group members, worked hard on the project, contributed new ideas or built on others' ideas. And then I asked the students to write exactly what they did for the project. One thing that I've been doing more and more, though, is making it optional. I don't require group projects usually. Students always have the option of doing it on their own. And I usually cap it at 3 people because it's more difficult to have one member coast if you're only in a group with 2 other people. Instead of focusing so much on the group project aspect, I focus more on group feedback, which is, I think, just as beneficial as group work. Making the project. I think giving feedback on a project from different perspectives is just as valuable and actually is possibly more similar to what happens in real life when we're working on teams, right? One person does something and the team members critique and give input, and then that person revises accordingly. I think group feedback is key though, because that's also how you can get an idea of how an external audience would see your work. Are you communicating effectively? You only know that when you try to communicate and then somebody else sees it differently. Another tip to keep in mind is time. You have to allow sufficient time to finish the projects. Now, I'm going to introduce to you some tools that are very fast, so you can probably finish a video project in maybe 1 or 2 class periods, say 2 hours maybe, or maybe it's a bigger project and you want to give them more time. That's definitely possible too. And don't forget to publish. The key to this entire process is not just making a project for the teacher, but sharing it with a wider, authentic audience. Now, when I say authentic audience, there's a lot of different possibilities there. The smallest group, of course, would be just sharing it with your other classmates. And then on the opposite side of the spectrum is sharing it widely, publicly on the World Wide Web. When I require students to share with their classmates, sharing is mandatory, but the freer and more open we get, the less I require students to publish, because some of my students are just shy. So I do have some public digital magazines that I've created with my classes, and my students were able to choose which pieces they wanted to share in that format and which they were just going to keep in their classroom. So another question that people frequently ask is, does it have to be digital? No, it does not. But the nice thing about digital is it's anytime, anywhere. As I said, this is learning and sharing outside the boundaries of the classroom. It also eliminates manual dexterity as the middleman. I don't like physical projects because I can't draw. My physical projects come out looking like they were made by a 2-year-old, which can be fun for my students. They love laughing at my artistic inability. But I definitely prefer digital projects where my artistic manual dexterity is not at all an issue. It also lets students focus on higher level goals of accomplishing their communication and making meaning rather than focusing on the creative process itself. On the other hand, analog projects are quick and easy. They're familiar. Students know how to do them. They're equitable because students have similar access to the tools, and they're reliable. Online resources might disappear. You might lose internet. So at least if you have chalk and pencils and paper, you know it's going to be there. It won't just vanish. Now, deciding whether you're going to use technology for the projects, I recommend considering the PICRAT model. Some of you might know SAMR. SAMR is a great way to do this too, the SAMR model. So for PICRAT, the question is, what is the student's relationship to the technology? Is it passive, interactive, or creative? And then the next question is, what is the teacher's use of technology? Does the teacher's use of tech replace, amplify, or transform traditional practice? So altogether, it looks something like this. And if the student's use is creative or interactive, and if the teacher's use amplifies or transforms traditional practice, it's probably worth thinking about using a digital tool rather than just an analog project, especially up here where it's creative and transforms. This frequently happens when you're creating multimodal projects and sharing and communicating online, because that really does transform traditional learning, and it really does involve lots of creative processes. So what kind of projects can you do? Well, it's really unlimited, but here are a few that I've had really good luck with over the years. The first is advertisements. I really like getting my students to do advertisements. The analog version that we've done in class is students plan a 7-day tour of Korea. In this case, we had 4 students prepare together. They had to plan all 7 days, make posters, and then write a quick sales pitch. Then the next day in class, so one day was preparing, the next day, the students split up. So 2 students from each group remained as the agents, the sales agents at their desk. And 2 students became customers, and they could wander around the room, choose a travel agency to visit, and then all of the students, one-to-one, travel agent to client, gave a 3-2-1 sales pitch. This is similar to the 4-3-2 fluency exercise you might already be familiar with. The student gave the sales pitch once and took 3 minutes to give it. The clients changed. The student gave the same sales pitch again, but only had 2 minutes to give it. Importantly, they're not allowed to change or drop information. They should speak more fluently and drop all those hesitations. So this is actually a lot of fun. And then a good follow-up, of course, is for students to go back to their groups and discuss the different tours that they saw advertised and decide which one they're most interested in taking. The digital version of this is 1 to 3 students working together to create a 2-minute or more video, again, advertising a 7-day tour. For this, they were supposed to be using specific class grammar that I had carefully selected and focused on each week in different lessons that built up to the kind of language you would need for an advertisement. We also have done this for books. Somebody asked about using projects with for extensive reading. We actually did book projects at the end, a book box or a 3-dimensional book introduction, basically. Again, including the specific class grammar. And again, we did a 3-2-1 sales pitch in which students could introduce their book, and they had certain things they had to hit, like introduce the characters, talk a little bit about the plot, who would like it. You had to make some specific recommendations, and so on. The digital version of this was similar to the tours. Students made a 2-minute or longer video advertising their favorite movies, games, TV shows, pretty much anything. We were very flexible. We've used different online tools to make wanted posters. Specifically, I use these in my classes where we're talking about has been, ing. This could be small teams or individual, analog or digital. For the analog version, I told them not to write the student's name and just draw a picture and write their crimes. And then the other students had to guess who the criminal was. For the digital version, we used S'more, and students actually got to run around and take pictures of the different crimes taking place. So that was pretty fun too. We've done self-introduction videos, actually not just videos, but also personal ads using Canva. So students get to introduce themselves, talk about their favorite hobbies, their interests. They discussed it together, Q&A on Padlet. For the personal ads, like you can see over here on the right, we actually use those as the basis for pen pals. So we posted all of the personal ads on a Padlet for each of my classes, and then they found a pen pal in a different class and had to write to them throughout the semester. But again, you can see the multimodal elements there. Experience stories, talking about the most interesting day, the most boring day, the funniest experience, something like that. And then you can put them all together at the end of the semester if you want in a digital magazine. I've been doing this every fall with my English composition class, where students write and then make it beautiful or multimodal, and then we publish it in the digital magazine. I really recommend storyjumper.com if you want to make a storybook. I think that for me is the easiest to use, most intuitive. I haven't had to introduce it to students. They're able to just play around and figure out how to use it. It's also makes it easy to share. It's totally free. For still images, I really like Canva, Adobe Spark, S'more, which lets you create interactive posters, PhotoVC for photo collages. Take a moment, if you can, to introduce your students to the idea of finding legal images rather than just downloading whatever they find on Google. Pexels, Pixabay, Burst, Wikimedia Commons, Pixneo, and even Google Image Search are really good ways to find photos that have Creative Commons licenses or are public domain. For videos, Animoto is hands down the easiest because you choose a theme, like a style, you upload your images, you add a little text, and boom. You can choose a different music if you want to, but it depends on your time. I promise you can create a 2-minute Animoto video in one class period, no problem. You could probably do it right now while you're listening to me and be done by the end of the presentation. Adobe Spark videos, also really easy. Canva. My Simple Show does animated explainer videos with the handwriting, and the outline, cartoons. You've seen them on YouTube. Screencast-O-Matic and Zoom are really good if you want to record your screen. For managing projects, I like to assign them using Google Docs. You have to use the Doctopus add-on. I don't have a good LMS at my school, so that's why I choose Google Docs. Padlet is a good way for assigning and managing all of the feedback and comments and questions. Class Dojo is really great for managing your feedback, not so much for interaction among students. And Google Sites is fantastic if you want students to actually publish their work in a digital magazine. So go make projects, have fun. And if you want to read more about multimodal projects and multiple literacies, here are some really awesome resources. And I want to point out, I have a shared stuff folder. If you're interested in the rubric I have used for a few years for my book projects, I think I've got that in my shared stuff folder. I also have some handouts from older presentations that introduce a lot of these online tools and have other suggestions as well. And if you're interested in learning more, please do come to the Korea TESOL conference. Our international conference is happening April 30th to May 1st. You can learn more at koreatesol.org/IC2022. So thank you very much for listening. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Lindsay. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a big round of applause to Lindsay Herron for her very insightful presentation. Thank you, Ming, for introducing Lindsay as well. A couple of questions for you, Lindsay, and also for Victor as well. It has to do with the tendency these days for people, for students, for you and me to use fewer words and more images. That can raise a bit of a concern for people who teach maybe English as a second or foreign language, because one of our main jobs actually is to help the students to develop their basic literacy in whatever language they're learning. If we can represent a lot of the things and ideas through images, then we may not be doing a good job in improving the overall language proficiency, improving their accuracy, their complexity of language use, and also their fluency. Your take on that? I think this is a very important question to discuss.
Honestly, I don't think it's a problem. I think it's more like what we do in the real world. Okay. In the real world, we communicate using different modes. I live in Korea. If I want to communicate with someone and I don't have the Korean words, I draw a picture or I use my body. Yeah. So okay. I think it's sort of similar to what we do in real life, but also it pushes people to realize where the gaps are in their knowledge. So if they are trying to communicate something and can't using words, then they become aware of that gap. And I think are pushed to fill it by learning the right words. But Professor Lim, perhaps you have a different take on that?
No, I totally agree with you, Prof. Lindsay, and I really enjoyed your presentation very much. I thought it was so illuminating and filled with so much great strategies. I would like to echo what Lindsay has shared. I think ultimately, if you think about authentic communication, words are always nested with other semiotic modes. I mean, even with regard to images and layout. So words are never and very seldom seen just in isolation. So I think if you think about helping students to meet the demands of communication in today's world, a part of it is helping them to recognize the context in which the words are situated, both the surrounding text as well as what Professor Lindsay has highlighted, that the context of culture is very important as well, because meaning is always made in context, and words are always situated with the different modes that are around them.
Thank you so much for the very interesting responses. Another big question that people have, I think this is something that Victor raised earlier on, is about, how we can help our students and also us as well to be more discerning, to be more critical. In the old days, maybe it was slightly easier for us to detect anything that is hidden, in a message. But today, with the multiple resources or semiotic resources, I think the author or the writers or the producers can sort of hide their sometimes evil intention, using all these multiple resources. So what can we do actually to help teachers and to help students to become more aware of the sort of the hidden meanings, the subtext of maybe advertisement, or you say advertisement, or other multimodal text that we see regularly in real life? Your take?
I can go first.
Yes, you can.
I think building on what I have said just now, and I would say that ultimately multimodal literacy is about helping students as well as teachers to recognize the way meanings are made differently across different semiotic modes. So if you think about persuasion, if you think about persuasion being expressed through language, well, if you look back to the great classical rhetoric, they talk about how we persuade through reason, through authority, through emotion. And that is in relation to language. But we can also think about how emotions can be used in images to persuade. What kind of images use emotions to persuade? Perhaps you have someone looking very pitiful, big eyes looking up at you longingly. What about reason? Can images you persuade through reason as well? I think it's possible. What about authority? Images can also express different types of authority, such as the use of logos or use of someone in a lab coat to express a certain sense of credibility. So I think part of recognizing and helping students to become more discerning is to recognize the different ways in which persuasion can be expressed, both linguistically as well as multimodally.
I don't actually teach that explicitly in my classes, but I think an implicit part of making multimodal projects and doing that kind of group feedback. I think as students are pushed to explain why they chose a specific way of communicating, a specific image, a specific video, a specific type of music, they're already a little bit aware of all of these things. But I think when you push them to explain, why did you choose this? Did you consider this other alternative? Or look at other people's works and wonder, why did they choose that when this is better? I think they begin to pay attention to the nuances of meaning that come up. And I think that attention is definitely the first step, becoming more aware of the way we're communicating and the way others are communicating with us. And then from there, it can maybe expand.
Yep. Ming, if you have any question, please go ahead. Yeah. Another important question is for teachers. There's a lot of teachers here in the audience. What sort of new skills they will need to develop in order to be more engaging, to be more skillful in teaching multimodal literacy? People used to say that if you teach reading, then you yourself should be a reader. If you teach writing skills, for example, then the teacher should also be practicing writing to become a writer as well. So what about multimodal literacy? What sort of new skills, what sort of practices teachers need to be involved in or engaged in? Victor.
Okay, that is a very big question. I think the challenge for teachers really is to teach in a way that they may not have been taught before.
Right.
And to teach work and ideas that they may not have learned themselves. So there's a lot of emphasis that's needed for professional learning of teachers to support them to build up their competencies, so that they can be confident enough to teach multimodal literacy in the classroom. So that is one area of work that should not be neglected. But I think beyond that, I also want to highlight that it is not difficult. It's not rocket science. We are familiar with the teaching of language, and essentially multimodal literacy is to add another layer to what we are already familiar with. So essentially, it's about the teaching of reading, writing, speaking, and listening, but also viewing and representing with multimodal text. And many other times, they can be taught in an integrated manner as well. So for instance, when you teach reading, you can also teach them to view the images that come with them. And many of the skills that are that you have already possessed with regard to teaching of reading can be applied to the viewing of these images as well. So I would say that while there is a new layer of knowledge and skills that need to be supported with professional learning, it is not, and it should not be overwhelming for the teachers. I think it all begins with a certain belief, a certain decision for the teachers to say that I'm not just a language teacher, I'm a literacy educator. And that is why I need to move beyond just the teaching of language to think about the other ways in which communication happens in our students' life.
Good point. Lindsay, do you want to add to that?
I just want to emphasize that you're absolutely right. Multimodal teaching is nothing new. We've been teaching multimodal. We have been teaching multimodally for as long as teaching has existed, right? When you want a student to be quiet, you stand closer. Right? And maybe look down. You use your height and proximity and facial expression to express displeasure. Or your volume and tone, like, hey, is totally different from, hey. You know, you're already teaching multimodally. I think the next step is to increase the awareness of it. And if you actually have a checklist of modes you want to pay attention to, you begin to do that automatically. Like if students make a project, you do have to be prepared to give more feedback than is good or your English is bad. You know, you need to be ready to say this color suits it well. It contributes to the overall melancholic mood. You know, so I would say make a checklist of what you want to convey yourself through different modes and what you want your students to be drawing on. And then that way, especially like if you have a rubric, that helps. So you go through the rubric and you check, are students doing all of these things? And you begin to pay attention to it in your own life too. Like, how am I communicating with my students and why did I make those choices?
Excellent. One last question before we end today's session. Transmedia literacy. How important is it, or it is, for students, for teachers to be competent in using multiple modes, multiple media for communication? Victor.
Okay, I'll give my take on it. The idea of transmedia literacy was really coined by the work of Carlos Scolari in his big project looking at the kind of literacies that young people are engaged with out of school. So looking at the kind of literacy practices that they have on the internet, social media, playing of games. I think before the webinar began, we talked about the use of Discord as a way where young people are actually communicating one another. And what Scolari observed was that there was a lot of learning that was taking place, a lot of literacies, if you like, that goes beyond what we are actually teaching the students in the classroom. So I think the heart of transmedia literacy is about valuing the kind of literacies that students are engaged in out of school and thinking about how we can bring that into the school context. Now, the question, of course, is why do we want to bring that into the school context? Well, I would say, and I go back to my earlier session about how the idea that students are equally proficient in the use of technology, they're equally savvy in this literacy, is not true. So there is disparity, there's impact equity among students. Some are a lot more savvy in terms of communicating with their friends online, creating virtual worlds in Minecraft. Some may not even have the tools and resources to know how to do that, which is why the schools become play a very important role to level the kind of differences that young people are engaged with out of school. So that is why I think it's important for educators to think about how we can bring these transmedia literacies into the classroom as a way to value, but at the same time also to support students who may not have the opportunities and the exposure and experiences with these literacies.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you so much again, Lindsay, and also Victor, for the excellent presentations today. And also, I would like to thank my co-moderator, Ajahn Ming Sosdipan, for helping with the chairing of the session. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a big round of applause to our excellent speakers today. Smallest announcements before we end today's session. Maria is going to put up the slide now. Don't forget, as I mentioned early on, there will be 4 webinar sessions altogether in March. Today is what we have just finished doing together. The next one is happening next Saturday, same time. And the topic is also equally exciting, and the speaker is also very exciting. Me and my colleague, Professor Rob Waring. And the following week, are we showing the following week? Next slide. Oh, no. So that's the slide for next week. I will be announcing the webinar sessions for the 2 other weeks in the month of March. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. And before we end today's session, please take a few minutes to fill in the evaluation form. And afterwards, you can download your certificate. And many of you have asked for the PowerPoint slides. I think we will make them available together with the recorded presentations of the 2 speakers today. Maria, do you have the link? Don't go away yet. We're still waiting for the big announcement, very important. Yes. Scan the QR code and then complete the survey. Please say something nice about the speakers today, and also thanking the British Council for making the session possible for everyone to enjoy today. Once again, thank you very much, everyone, and goodbye for now. And I hope to see you again next Saturday, same time, same, I think it's a different Zoom link that you will be receiving from British Council Indonesia. Bye-bye, everyone. Thanks again, Lindsay.
Thank you
Victor,
so much, everyone.
and Mink.
See you next week, Prof.
See you next week.